And so my goal for this is to show you all, or to make the case rather, how our thinking actually works, to give you some additional perspective into what might be going on in your own life. And that may be in the context of health and fitness, that may be in the context of work-related things, it could be in the context of relationships. That's one of the beautiful things about everything we talk about today, is just how applicable it all is in a variety of different contexts. So while we may be talking about it in specific contexts today, I want you to keep in mind that you can apply this into whatever is most relevant for you in your life. But inherently, what that means is that it probably will challenge some of our notions of how things have always been or how things are. And so I do want to just make you aware of that that's totally normal. If you feel that way, that's fine. Sit with it a little bit. Definitely consider some of these concepts and some of the tools that I give you with regard to some of these concepts so that you can really make the most of everything that I give you today. Okay, so that's all I'm asking, is just keeping an open mind as we're talking about mindset related things. In this case, the mindset makeover, negative thinking in particular. Before we dive into things, I do want to share a confession that I have, which is when I was 7 years old, I snuck a viewing, which I shouldn't have. I snuck a viewing of the movie Psycho. Give me if you're on camera, give me a hand raise if you've seen the movie. You can put in the chat box too if you've ever seen the movie Psycho. Just give me a thumbs up. The famous Hitchcock movie, I think from the 60s, maybe, black and white film. And definitely by today's standards, not that scary of a movie, but for a 7-year-old, terrifying. And it's the only scary movie that ever screwed me up for months afterwards. I'm talking, I would be terrified anytime. Obviously, the famous shower scene in Psycho, for those of us who may not have seen it. This is a movie about a woman who travels to a motel ran by this gentleman and his mother. And while she's, unwinding after the end of the day, she's in the shower. All of a sudden, the curtain gets ripped open. There's a shadowy figure, and she essentially gets murdered by stabbing. And so 7-year-old processing that scene, it haunted me. It haunted me anytime I was in the shower there afterwards. It haunted me when I would try to sleep. I couldn't sleep for months. I would struggle with nightmares. I would struggle with being afraid to be in my room in the dark. And it just brought on all of these negative thoughts about being scared and being afraid because of that one experience and the thoughts that I was having related to that experience. And I share this story with you because it's going to become very relevant later into sort of our framework for how negative thinking actually works. And most importantly, what we can do to start to shift those negative thoughts. And the interesting thing, as we'll see in a moment, is getting rid of negative thoughts is not what many of us think that it is. We can't just stop having negative thoughts. Okay, so I want us to keep that in mind for a moment, but we'll revisit this here in a moment. Prior to everything else we talk about, though, many of you on this call already know me in some capacity, but it behooves us just to share a little bit why you should even care what's coming out of my mouth. My name is Alex McBrady. I'm an online fitness coach where we talk about things outside of fitness, as some of us in here are already aware of. But my background is actually in psychology. I got my degree in psychology with an emphasis in mindset and motivation from the University of Michigan many, many, many years ago. And that obviously plays a big role in everything that we're talking about today. I too personally had a transformation where I lost nearly 100 pounds over the course of 15 months, my senior year in high school. This is about 15 years ago. So I lost all the weight, kept it off, have continued to develop myself ever since. And the reason I share this with you, not only in the health and fitness context, but the actual application of these concepts in my own life to make the person that you see and talk to and interact with all the time is the product of all of the same tools that I'm giving you now. Now, back then, it was also by accident. This wasn't something that purposefully was implemented on my behalf for myself, but it now in hindsight and having learned and applied all these things in other contexts, I can see now that it was sort of intuitively adopted by me back then to allow me to overcome, even going as far back as the 7-year-old story, the 7-year-old Alex, after watching the movie Psycho. As we'll see, I sort of accidentally stumbled upon the solution for how to get rid of negative thoughts. I've been a full-time online fitness and health coach for over a decade, helping people now across. We've helped individuals, men and women across 6 different countries in 19 states. And why that's important is because for the last decade, we've been applying these principles to help men and women to shift the way that they think. Because we firmly believe that it's not just the nutrition plan and the exercise plan that allows people to transform their life. It is what's going on up here. It's how they think about themselves. It's how they think about the process. It's what they actually want from it. Fitness is the means, not the end. And so that over a decade long experience of actually implementing this with people means that it works, and it works really, really well, as some of us in here know this already. Now, the fact that we've served people across 6 different countries and 19 states tells us that these are universally applicable, okay, across different cultures, across different backgrounds. These principles and the tools that I'm going to give you to start to reframe your mindset is true across the board, which is exciting because it means it will work for you too. But enough about me. We don't care about me. We care about the good stuff. But without getting too corporate on us, we do have to make sure we're all playing the same game here. Okay, so a couple of key definitions we're all going to need to understand. The first is what actually is a thought. And I want us to think about thoughts as the interpretation of a singular event that's happening in the here and now. Okay, so we can think of this as the moment-to-moment interpretation of what's happening around us. Very important. The second definition is beliefs. Beliefs are the conclusions that we draw from those thoughts. And they influence how we feel about ourselves and our place in the world, influence our views about the world at large. And what's important about beliefs is that these are based on repeated thoughts. So these are the persistent thoughts that we have about ourselves and the world around us. Okay, so thoughts are moment to moment. Enough repeated thoughts lead to certain beliefs that we hold, and these are the more persistent across domains. And then lastly, mindset. Our mindset we can think of as the filter. These are the patterns of thoughts and beliefs that influence our perception of ourselves in the world. Okay, so thoughts are very moment-to-moment interpretations. Beliefs are the more consistent way that we interpret events. And then the mindset is the filter through which we see what's happening around us. So they're all interconnected because the filter, if we see things more negatively, to keep things relevant, and we interpret events, so our moment-to-moment thoughts are more negative because we're looking through a negative filter. That means we'll have more repeated negative thoughts, which will then lead to the generation of negative beliefs about ourselves, which then only perpetuate seeing and having a stronger filter for negativity about ourselves. And then the process repeats, right? It's the sort of cyclical nature of things. Now you'll notice there's a couple of keywords here that are underlined: repeated patterns, repeated patterns. And the reason I highlighted those words, repeated patterns, is because what that tells us is it's about habits, right? We know that habits are repeated behaviors. Habits are our default ways of acting based on repetition. And so if the thoughts and the way that we think about the world are a result of repeated patterns, then that tells us that the way we think is not a disposition, it's not a genetic trait, it's not a fixed variable. It really is just a habit. And because it's a habit, it means that we can change it. That's why we're here today. So keep those definitions in mind. Thoughts are moment to moment, beliefs are persistent, repeated thoughts, and the mindset is the filter through which we're viewing everything. So now that we know what thoughts, beliefs, and mindset are, what exactly is a negative thought? Or what is negative thinking? The thing that we want to try to resolve in some context in our life. The thing to understand about those moment-to-moment interpretations, right, those thoughts, is that everything that we experience is the result of some sort of stimulus. We think of the 5 senses: our sight, our sound, the smells, the taste, the tactile touch of things. The way that we engage with and experience the world is a set of these stimuli. And we can think of that as just raw data. It's just raw data that our body and our brain is bringing in, but then it needs to be made sense of, right? If I just handed you a sheet of paper with an assortment of random numbers and told you no context, you would not know what those numbers meant. Is it a phone number? Is it a bank account number? Is it a math equation? Is it a computer password? What is the set of numbers you've given me, right? Now, if I hand you that set of numbers and I told you that it's a password, then that gives you more context to make sense of those numbers. Okay, is it only 4 numbers? Is it a PIN code? Is it 7 numbers? Is it some other sort of related password? So our brain essentially has to give context to the data that we're bringing in. And it does this through story, right? So all of the stimulus we're experiencing, and we can think of this as the emotions that we experience, the actual physical stimuli that we're having. Our brain then writes a story. And when it becomes negative is when we are writing a story that causes us some sort of emotional discomfort. Okay, so here's an example. Say I'm here giving this webinar. 5 minutes beforehand, you didn't see me. I was down on the floor of my office doing a set of push-ups to try to work out some of the nervous energy that I had to make sure that I showed up well for you guys today. Okay, and so with that, but prior to doing those push-ups, felt a little nervous, right? Heart rate was a little fast. I could feel myself, maybe my stomach was a little queasy and turning over in knots a little bit because I was just nervous to make sure that I did a good job. Okay. Now that's just the stimulus, right? The rapid heartbeat, the turning of my stomach, maybe the sweaty palms. That's just the data. But then my brain has to write the story. And that story could have been, Alex, you're so excited to give this presentation today. It's going to help a lot of people. They're going to be really excited to learn these concepts. That's fun. That's one story. Or the story could also be, did you prepare enough, Alex? Are you going to mess this up in front of all these people who are counting on you to do a good job? Right? Now, one of those interpretations is going to lead to a certain emotional reaction compared to another. So, negative thinking is essentially how we are defaulting to interpreting the data that we're experiencing. And this can be influenced by our background, by our upbringing, by our life experiences. All influence those interpretations, right? From very young childhood, how we observe other adults in our life react to things, okay? How they interacted with us as children and allowed us to feel a certain way about ourselves, kind of setting the baseline of our beliefs about ourselves. All of these elements influence how we're likely to interpret stories. Okay, but remember, as we said before, it's a habit, so it can be changed. But most importantly, we need to recognize that these stories are a subjective experience. They are not an accurate reflection of reality. And so part of shifting our negative thinking, which is just we're defaulting to negative stories about what we're experiencing, comes to identifying, challenging, and changing the stories that we're telling in our head. I'm going to give you some specific tools for how to do that here in a moment. But let's talk about some just prime examples of negative thinking patterns. And one of the things I'm going to send everyone home with today, I'll send it to you in an email afterwards, is a list of the 15 most popular and common negative thinking patterns and what to do about it. Okay, so you can kind of go in there. Everyone will recognize themselves in at least one of those. But 3 really, really popular negative thinking patterns. First is emotional reasoning. Okay, emotional reasoning is essentially when we feel an emotional reaction, that in our mind becomes justification or proof of a certain reality. So here's an example. Say you're having a conversation with a coworker and they say something that makes you angry. If we're falling prey to emotional reasoning, then we'll tell ourselves, well, I'm feeling angry, and so therefore they meant for me to feel angry. Like me feeling angry means they were trying to cause me harm. Okay? When an alternative narrative is that maybe it was a miscommunication. Maybe they thought what they said was harmless, but it triggered something in you that they were unaware of that then made you angry. And so maybe they had no intention to make you angry. It had no intention to cause you harm. It was just a miscommunication. Okay, so emotional reasoning is we use the emotions that we're experiencing as proof that something is true. The second here, mind reading, sort of similar to emotional reasoning, but in a slightly different way. Mind reading is exactly what it sounds like. We are assuming what people think. So here's an example. Say you walk into a party, and across the room, there's a group of individuals. Maybe there's 2 or 3 individuals, and you can clearly tell that they are whispering to each other and looking at you. Okay. Now, if we're falling prey to some negative mind reading, we might not having any interaction with them or knowing them whatsoever. We might tell ourselves, oh, they're gossiping about me, or they're making fun of me, or they're judging me, maybe for something I'm wearing, maybe for showing up to the party alone, for any number of things, right? So we're essentially assuming what's happening in their minds based on something that we're experiencing. When again, an alternative story is maybe they really liked your outfit and they were telling each other and looking at you to admire the outfit that you were wearing. So maybe it was actually a positive thing. Okay? This is where that filter comes into play, right? Because if we're prone to filter things as negative, then the otherwise mundane experience of just witnessing people acknowledge you could be interpreted as being negative. Okay? But that's mind reading, is we're assuming other people's thoughts. And then probably one of the most popular, if we tend to frequently fall prey to negative thinking, is called catastrophizing. And catastrophizing is essentially just immediately jumping to worst case scenarios. Okay? If I were catastrophizing about this event, I might have said, well, Alex, if you even slip up once, these people will never talk to you again. They'll think you're a complete and utter fraud. Right? So jumping to super worst case scenario from just one minor setback. Okay? Like I said, there's a whole host of like these frequent negative thinking patterns. I'll send that to everyone after today. But just to give us an idea of how this can kind of play out in our life. But now I want to draw attention to how this really is a subjective experience. So I want everyone to think for a moment about a boss that has given them critical feedback on a performance review. Okay, we've all had that experience in some capacity. We all know the emotions we felt, right? So it's a bit of critical feedback. Now I want you to imagine how you would feel if it came from a boss that you hated, someone you despised, thought they were terrible at their job. Maybe they were terrible at their job. And then I want you to imagine for a moment what emotion you would feel if it was a boss you admired, if it was someone you had a really good relationship with. Chances are good that your emotional reaction would be different if it were a boss you hated versus one you admired, right? The boss you hated, you might think, person's being an asshole. They don't know what they're talking about. They can't even do their own job correctly. How are they going to tell me how to do mine, right? For the boss you admire, you might take that differently. You might take that as, well, I really value this person's opinion, and maybe they make some good points. Maybe there's some areas that I can really work to improve. Maybe I need to be a little bit more organized, or whatever the case is, right? So the exact same scenario, the exact same set of stimuli, receiving critical feedback from a boss, can be perceived in 2 very different ways based on just on how we feel about the person. Okay? So again, I just point this out to show you guys that this really is, these stories that we write really are subjective, and they can be different for the exact same set of stimuli. And so the first step, identifying, right? We have to identify, challenge, and change in order to shift our negative thinking to be more positive. Identifying is first recognizing that the thoughts that we have initially after an event are not always true. And so starting to question our initial reactions based on the context can be the first step in starting to shift some of those things. Okay? Now, eliminating negative thinking. I want to go back to that story of the movie for a moment, the Psycho movie, because I have here labeled the unintuitive method. Because getting rid of negative thinking is not as simple as just not having negative thoughts. Okay, so when I watched Psycho as a 7-year-old and it gave me nightmares for months, I would remember going to bed, the lights would be off, I'd be under my covers and eyes wide open, because suddenly around the room, shadows become figures. That pile of clothes in the corner suddenly becomes an object looking at me, or some sort of figure looking at me, right? The crack in the closet door suddenly becomes a gateway to the monsters in the closet. The branch clicking on the window outside suddenly becomes someone creeping on the roof. Okay. Now, what happened is I would tell myself while I'm laying there, it's not scary. It's not scary. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. There's no danger. You're fine. It's okay. So I'd be constantly telling myself not to have the negative thoughts. I'd be trying to talk myself out of the negative thoughts. But our brains don't work that way. Our brains don't work that way. And to illustrate this point, I want to do a brief exercise. So if everyone could for a moment, all I want you to do, when I tell you to, I'm going to count down from 3. And when I say 0, I want you to try as hard as you can not to think about the thing that I'm going to tell you in a moment. But before I share it, as soon as you do have this thought, I want you to comment in the chat. Basically, I want you to not think about a shark. Okay? So when I count down, it's okay if you're thinking about it now. But when I go 3, 2, 1, 0, when I hit 0, I want you to do anything in your power to not think about a shark. But the moment you do, I want you to pop in the chat just the word shark. Cool? Okay. We're going to start this in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1, 0. All right, they're starting to come in. Now, the first couple seconds I gave you was the previous screen of not thinking about a shark. Many of us were probably successful in not thinking about a shark the first couple seconds, right? But then how many of us, the second I changed the screen to this image, how many of us then started thinking about a shark? Probably all of us, right? Maybe some of us are still holding out. Now, if we look at this photo, there's not actually any sharks in this photo, right? There are things that remind us of sharks. Obviously, the environment, the ocean environment being underwater, that's where sharks habitate. The fish reminds us of other sea creatures. The coral reef reminds us of tropical, which makes us think of sharks, okay? So there's a lot of things that are similar or relevant to sharks, but there's not actually any sharks in this photo. But why then did it spur us to think about a shark when we were trying not to? This is what was happening to me with the shadowy figures in my room when I was trying not to have nightmares. Okay, when we tell ourselves not to think about something, our brain makes a mental note of that. And what happens then is our brain in the background starts to scan our environment for anything that remotely resembles what we're trying to avoid. So your brain is doing what you told it to do, which is to avoid this thing. This also happens with our food too. You can juxtapose this with food as well. When you tell yourself not to eat a food, suddenly it seems like it's everywhere. This is why, okay? Because now your brain is scanning for anything that might be a shark. And so anything that resembles a shark suddenly triggers the alarms in your brain because you're supposed to be avoiding that thing, inadvertently making you think of a shark, right? This is what was happening to me in my room as a 7-year-old. I would tell myself that there are no monsters in this room, and then suddenly everything became a monster, right? So if we're battling negative thoughts in our life, negative thoughts about our ability to exercise, negative thoughts about our ability to adopt a healthy diet, negative thoughts about ourselves and our performance in our career, if we just tell ourselves not to have those negative thoughts, we're just going to perpetuate more of them. So this is what I meant by it's a little bit unintuitive, because we can't just stop having negative thoughts by telling ourselves not to have negative thoughts. We have to, because again, the repeated pattern, the habit, the number one way to get rid of old habits is to overwrite them with new habits. Okay? Is to overwrite them with new habits. So if we want to get rid of negative thinking, we have to add more positive thoughts. Okay? And now we're going to dive into exactly how to do that. So I mentioned earlier, there are 3 steps to doing this: identifying, challenging, and changing our negative thoughts. We've been talking about how to change our negative thoughts by adopting more positive. We'll talk specifics about that in a moment, but I want to jump back to identifying and challenging our negative thoughts first. Okay? There's many of us might be familiar with the Greek philosopher Socrates, who was well known and is well known for his sort of Socratic method, which was essentially to question everything. Now, did this habit of questioning everything get him publicly executed? Yes, but it was a different time. But from his work and from his methods, there is a concept in cognitive behavioral therapy. Very briefly, cognitive behavioral therapy is essentially a practice of therapeutic systems for addressing things like anxiety and depression and other mental health disorders that essentially postulates that most of our disordered thinking and behavior stems from our thoughts and our beliefs about ourselves and the world. Okay? And so Socratic questioning is essentially taking elements of what Socrates was onto in terms of questioning everything and wanting to actually understand what was happening in front of him instead of just taking other people's word for it, and combines it with this ability of questioning our thoughts. Okay, so this is where we're in that challenge, that identify and challenge period of this. Okay, and so this is an actual exercise you can do. It's these 5 questions that we're going to go through one by one here, very briefly. 5 questions that we can journal, we can prompt ourselves with when we're having an experience, when we're having a set of negative thoughts, to allow us to actually begin to challenge those negative thoughts. And so the question number 1 is, what is the evidence that this thought is true? What is the evidence that this thought is true? Okay. So if you remember before, these interpretations of events, we're starting to question the reality of the thought that we're having. We're starting to bring into light the subjectivity of it to start to lower our defenses a little bit, okay, to brunt the emotional reaction. What is the evidence that this thought is true? The second question, if I'm wrong, what's another way of looking at the situation? So now it's prompting us to think of alternative narratives, alternative stories that could have been written about the situation to further reinforce the subjectivity of it. Okay? Because here's the thing, when we're able to acknowledge, obviously when we interpret it as negative and we're having a negative emotional experience, it's easy to sit in that. But once we can start to question whether it's actually real, right? Like if I were to watch the movie Psycho today, I know it's not real. It would not scare me anymore, right? I have a little bit more perspective in life to be like, okay, I'll be fine, you know? And so this is what happens when we start to ask ourselves, is what I'm experiencing real? Because then we can remove ourselves from the emotional reaction. So if I'm wrong, what's another way of looking at the situation? The third question, if I'm right, what can I do about the situation? Right? So we already called into question the reality and the subjectivity of it. Is it real? We started to brainstorm some alternative stories or an alternative way to interpret the event in front of us. But now with question number 3, if you're right, what can you do about it? Now we're starting to get into a solution-focused mindset. What can I actually do to resolve this problem? Okay. Because in the event that we are correct, we're having a negative experience and it's genuine, now we're actually doing something to solve it. And what that does is it gives us back control instead of feeling helpless and hopeless in a negative situation. Okay, so now we start to focus on what are some solutions we can do. Question number 4, what advice would you give to a friend in the exact same situation? I know we've all had this experience. A friend has come to us asking for advice. They're having some issues in their life. And damn it, we give great advice, don't we? We can give the best advice to our friends. But often when it comes to following that advice ourselves, hit or miss. Hit or miss, right? And why is that? Why do we give such great advice to other people, but then it's so much harder for us? And it really just boils down to the fact that when you're giving advice to a friend, you are not emotionally invested in it. I mean, yes, you're emotionally invested in the person and you want them to be thriving and be well, etc. But you yourself are not experiencing the emotions. Whereas when you are going through the situation or the event or the negative experience, you have to navigate what to do about it and the negative emotions. So this is why it's so different and why we see that we can give advice to other people, but we don't necessarily take it ourselves. So by asking ourselves this question and essentially putting us in this position, what advice would I give to a friend who's in my exact same situation? What we're doing is we're creating emotional distance. And it's interesting because this works even if you know you're doing it to yourself. Even if you know that you're just trying to create emotional distance so that you can have better clarity and more rationality in what to do, it still works. Okay? So we're creating emotional distance so that we jump from our emotional brain to a more rational brain. We don't make great decisions when we're in our emotional brain. Right? That's not where logic and reason exist. So creating emotional distance allows us to transition into a more rational brain so that we can come up with better ideas or better plan. And then lastly, question number 5, given everything that you've already gone through with the other prompts, the evidence that your thought is true, what other ways of interpretation if you're wrong, what you can do about it if you're right, and what advice you would give to a friend in the exact same situation, the 5th question is, what should I do right now? And this is probably the most important question of all, because what this does is it gets us out of reflection mode and into action mode. Because often, just evaluating our thoughts is not enough. We have to actually do something, right? Because remember, habits change when we take different action and when we take different action repeatedly. And so if our negative thinking, if our filters, our beliefs, and our thoughts are repeated patterns, we have to start acting differently to override our default negative way of thinking. Okay, so we have to start doing something different. And that's what question 5 prompts us to do, is what can I do right now? So let's go back to that party scenario. I walk into a party. Across the room, I see a group of 3. They're whispering to each other and they're all looking at me. I interpret that event as they're judging me. They're judging me for being here alone. Okay? And so I'm going to go through this and I'm going to question, what is the evidence that I have is true, that thought is true, that they are judging me for showing up by myself. They think I'm a loser. Okay, well, they're over there whispering to themselves, looking at me. So clearly they've acknowledged me. Are they talking about me? Perhaps. Perhaps they're talking about me. Have I ever met these people before in my life? I have not. Okay, so do they actually know that I'm here alone? No, I guess they don't. Okay, and if they don't know that, then are they able to actually make that conclusion? Probably not. Okay, so if I'm wrong about this, what's another way of looking at the situation? Maybe they like my outfit. Maybe they like the way I did my hair. Maybe they like the way that I walked in confidently. Maybe they're not even talking about me. Maybe they just happen to be looking in my direction because I just walked in the front door. Maybe they're waiting for somebody else to come in. Maybe I look like somebody they know. Right? If I'm right and they are actually judging me, what can I do about the situation? Well, like I said, I don't know these people. Am I ever going to see them again after this? Maybe not if they're judging me, right? So what can I do about the situation? Well, I could just ignore it. These people's opinions don't mean anything. I've never met them before. What do they know about me, right? I could go over and I could talk to them to actually see. Maybe they're actually really nice people and I'm wrong about the whole thing, right? Or maybe once they talk to me, they'll realize that I'm a really nice person and then they'll feel bad for having judged me for being here alone. Maybe they'll be envious because they're too afraid to come to a party by themselves, right? So maybe I should just go over and just have a polite conversation and just see what happens, right? So now we can start to think about those solutions, right? If I had a friend that told me that they had showed up to a party by themselves, and as soon as they walked in the door, a group of people were whispering to themselves and looking at them, and they felt really insecure about it, what advice would I give them? I'd probably reassure them that they don't know the full story, right? That they couldn't potentially jump to that conclusion having never met these people before, right? It's not like it's their arch nemesis. We would probably remind them of all of the other possibilities that were out there And so that the chance that this was true is probably pretty slim. And that would make us feel a little more comfortable. And then what should you do now? Given those solutions, should I go over there and should I talk to them? Should I ignore them? Right? No wrong answer there. Whatever you feel comfortable acting on, but doing something so you're not just basking in the thoughts. Right? As an aside, here's another interesting thing, research they've done about the emotional reaction to negative thoughts. They've shown in scans, brain scans, that the actual physiological emotional reaction, right, the release of neurochemicals in our brain that result in the emotions that we experience, that chemical release only lasts 90 seconds. So the initial emotional reaction that we have, good or bad, lasts 90 seconds. But many of us agree that we probably feel negative emotions much longer than that. Right? If we did poorly on a project and we got that critical feedback, that might sit with us for an entire day or a couple of days. Right? Or if somebody said something that was sort of rude to us at a party, that might stick with us all day. Emotions chemically last 90 seconds. The reason that they continue to haunt us is because of our beliefs. We keep refreshing our mind about the negative experience. We ruminate on it, right? Rumination is constantly revisiting negative scenarios. So when we're hypercritical of ourselves and we're having a negative experience and we keep reminding ourselves of that negative experience, we essentially keep re-triggering the emotional reaction, right? It's like those sand, I can't think of the name of them, the sand timers, you know, the ones that get board games and things, you flip it over and it trickles the sand down, right? So if you think one of those that lasts 90 seconds, you have an emotional reaction, boom, timer starts, 90 seconds down. Every time you remind yourself, you're flipping it back over and restarting the timer, right? So taking action sort of allows us to move past, because our brains also don't like unfinished things, right? This is why music gets stuck in our head. If there's a melody that gets stuck in your head, I guarantee you it's just a small part of the song, usually the chorus, that just gets stuck on repeat over and over again. What they found, again, fun tip for you, if you want to get a song that's stuck in your head out of your head, sing it all the way to the end. Because once you finish it, your brain can let it go. Our brain doesn't like unfinished things. So when we're just ruminating on negative thoughts and we're not actually taking any action to do anything about it, that's akin to an unfinished project in our brain, and we'll continue to ruminate on it, which then resets the negative feeling and emotion that we're having in perpetuity. So the reason question 5 is so important is by taking action and doing something, anything, to either remove ourselves, resolve the situation, gather more data. It doesn't really matter what. Doing something allows us to mark it as complete. We can get past it. Right? So these are very powerful questions that you can revisit anytime you're having a negative thought about something, to start to identify what you're experiencing, but also to challenge what you're experiencing. But there was that third part. We have to actually be able to change our negative thinking. And we already established that you can't just do that by not having negative thoughts. That's not how this works, Alex. Okay? Because that just leads us to having more negative thoughts. So we have to override the negative thoughts with more positive thoughts. We have to start thinking more positively to create new habits, to create new patterns of thinking, new filters through which we see the world, so that it gets interpreted as more positive. So that then, by having more positive experiences, you're pushing out the negative. Make you feel better. How do we do that? How do we override the negative thoughts with more positive ones? There are 3 ways that we can begin to do this, all very easy to implement, but require practice. Getting curious, shifting our perspective, and the one that surprises most people, to be less humble. We're going to talk about that one at the end. Okay? But getting curious. What do I mean by getting curious? Well, ultimately, every setback or failure that we have provides a lesson that if we learn it, allows us to do things better in the future. Okay. It's a phrase that I heard long ago. I don't remember who said it, but essentially it went like this. You don't learn anything when you're right. You only reaffirm something you already knew. But when you're wrong, gives you the opportunity to learn something new and to do it better in the future. So when I say get curious, what I really mean is when we're having a negative thought about ourselves, maybe as a result of falling short in some activity that we're doing. Okay, maybe we didn't lose as much weight as we wanted to lose, didn't do as many workouts as we wanted, didn't lift as much weight as we wanted. Maybe we didn't perform on that work project as well. Maybe we didn't communicate in our relationship as well as we would have wanted in a particular context. Instead of beating ourselves up, getting curious on, okay, I didn't perform the way that I wanted. What lesson can I pull from that experience to do it better next time? What has that experience taught me? And then essentially what we're doing is we're turning these negative experiences into something meaningful. Something that allows us to continue to get better so that we experience less of it. Okay, so it ultimately comes down to shedding perfection. Perfection is one of the worst traps of all because we'll never be perfect and it just forces us to procrastinate and wait until we are perfect, which means we never start. And to embrace constant improvement. So getting curious boils down to what lesson can I pull from the experience to do better next time? Getting curious. There is always a lesson to be learned in every setback. So by shifting our perspective this way and getting curious, we can turn those moments of underperformance as something sort of exciting because it's an opportunity to improve ourselves. And the more we do this, then we solve the mistakes we make, and then we make less mistakes in the future, and then we have less of those experiences. Right? Instead of having the emotional reaction, shutting ourselves down, ignoring it, and then it just repeats itself. So step one of overriding our negative thoughts to have more positive thoughts is to get curious for the lesson. Our second, shifting perspective, slightly different than the last side about getting curious, is to embrace hardship as mental strength training. So what I mean by this, in strength training, in the gym, the most fundamental principle to helping somebody get stronger is the idea of progressive overload. And what that concept is, progressive overload, basically just means that if somebody is going to get stronger, they have to repeatedly be exposed to a stress that's above their capabilities. And then in so doing, they will incrementally get stronger to meet the demands of that stress. This is why in our strength training routines, we always try to add extra weight. We try to push the weight, lift a little bit heavier. We try to do more reps to push our body a little bit more. And it's that progressive overload that actually allows us to get stronger. How does that play in this context? Well, we're embracing the challenges and the negative experiences we have as mental strength training, progressive overload. Okay? It makes me think of that phrase, the worst experience of our life is always the worst experience of our life. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but ultimately what that means is we don't know what our new worst is going to be until something greater happens than we've already experienced. Right? Like if you just very briefly think of a really challenging time in your life that you went through, that set the new standard for what actually caused you stress. Anything that fell below that threshold, you can probably handle pretty well, right? Probably doesn't cause a lot of anxiety, it doesn't cause a lot of stress. You're able to withstand greater amounts of stress because of the most challenging times you've gone through, right? Just like lifting weights, okay? If I'm used to lifting a certain amount of weight, I can lift everything lesser than it without too much issue, right? If I'm used to, whoa, we're jumping ahead. If I'm used to bicep curling 25 pounds, using a 5-pound dumbbell, I'm not gonna feel like anything, right? So when we talk about shifting our perspective with our negative experiences, what we're ultimately talking about is viewing it as part of the process for progressive overload. Every stressful situation we go through is training us to be able to withstand greater amounts of stress. It doesn't mean that we necessarily always want to be seeking greater amounts of stress, because trust me, life will do that for you. Don't have to worry about that. But what that does mean is that anything lesser than that threshold, that new threshold of stress, is going to be less stressful for you. It's not going to be as bad. Okay? So these moments of growth prepare us to better handle everything else. So that's the second way, getting curious, shifting our perspective. And then lastly, the one that confuses a lot of people is to be less humble. Many of us have grown up in households with parents that told us it was important to always be humble. And to a degree, this is true. We don't want to be walking around conceited and cocky and making everyone in the world hate us. That's not the answer. But a lot of us struggle to actually see our own potential. And what that does is when we experience negative thoughts about ourselves, that humbleness actually reinforces some of those negative thoughts, right? Because if we're telling ourselves, I'm okay at this thing, but I'm not great, right? Like I'm nothing to write home about. And then we face a setback, right? That causes us a negative reaction. Then it just exacerbates the problem. Well, I'm not that great at this thing and I didn't perform that well, so clearly I'm just no good at this. I'll never be good at this. Right? So counterintuitively, we want to be less humble. But what exactly does that mean? I like to refer to this, and this is the easiest tip that I can give you, the most immediately applicable tip to start to override your negative thoughts is the power of yet. The word yet. Anytime you have a negative thought about yourself or your capabilities, just add the word yet to the end. I haven't met my weight loss goal yet. I don't feel confident in my new dance choreography yet. I am not where I want to be in life yet. Because what that does, and I recommend you try this next time you have one of these thoughts, just add the word yet. You will actually feel a difference in how much stress you experience when you use this strategy. Okay? But ultimately, what we're doing is we're reaffirming the belief that if we're doing all of the other things, if we're identifying and challenging our negative thoughts, if we're getting curious about the lessons and we're embracing that constant improvement, if we're shifting our perspective to think of that concept of progressive overload, viewing our hardships as mental strength training, and if we're keeping ourselves hopeful for what's to come, because we know and see our potential, suddenly we start to think a little bit better about ourselves. We start to change the way that we think about ourselves. We start to be a little less humble. And that then empowers us to actually carry forth the actions that we need to do to get the things that we want. Right? And this is what happened to me with going back to the nightmares for a second. I accidentally stumbled upon this thought of overriding negative thoughts with more positive thoughts, because what I ended up doing to eventually start to be able to sleep again is, instead of trying to avoid thinking about monsters, which clearly didn't work, I started to think about the things in my life that I was actually excited for, which at the time was school. Only time in my life I was ever excited for school. But nevertheless, I was excited because I got to sit next to my friends. We got to talk a lot. It was really a great experience for that age for me at 7 years old. And so I would think about school. I would think about the friends I was going to talk to the next day. I would think about the classes I was excited to go to. I would think about X, Y, Z related to school. And what happened is, by focusing my thoughts on thinking about those things, I ended up no longer thinking about what I was afraid of. Because we can't just stop having negative thoughts by trying to avoid negative thoughts. We have to actively write more positive thoughts so that they override and overlay and eventually push out the negative thoughts. And we do that by first identifying what negative thoughts we're having, right? If we fall into a particular pattern of thinking, again, that list I'm going to give you at the end of today is going to be really helpful for this. We know what to watch out for. Then we have to challenge those negative thoughts when they arise, to start to reinterpret the stimuli that we're experiencing around us. And then we have to put these 3 principles in practice to adopt more positive thoughts, being curious about the lessons we can pull, shifting our perspective and viewing it as mental strength training, and then being less humble and more aware of the potential we have to accomplish what we want in the future. If we make it a practice to do those things, because that's the thing, this is a practice. This is not going to be an overnight shift, but it's going to be a repeated practice to create new habits around the way that you see the world. And if you do that, this will not make your life all sunshine and rainbows. I won't lie to you. Life is just hard sometimes. But what it will do is if you practice these things diligently, it will put more sunshine and rainbows in your life, because you will see things more positively. You will see more opportunities around you because you're more open to them.